Welcome everyone to this important interview. On the 29th of this month, July 2021, will be the Earth Overshoot Day, coming earlier than that of last year, which was August 22nd. And many people have come about it and they have been asking why this year it's so early, because last year probably the pandemic size have reduced our carbon footprint. But it is not sustainable that way because a lot of life have been lost and several hardships untold. And this is how it could look like. In our economy, we have budgets. And once the budget gets exhausted, we might keep looking for supplementary budgets and keep borrowing or keep trying to borrow to balance the budget. But it can get to a certain point where we might not be able to borrow to finance our economy or the budgets. And this is where the hardship come on the people, and it leads to food insecurity, hunger, and different kind of crisis. This is the same scenario that we are having with our environment today as to the Earth Overshoot. And to me, I have with me the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Footprint Network with me today, Laurel Hanscom. And she's going to tell us more about what this year's Earth Overshoot it's all about, how they arrive at the July 29th. Thank you for coming to this interview. You now have the floor.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think you very succinctly and accurately portrayed our work. I think it's very challenging to talk about these things given the repercussions, and I think what you're doing is fantastic and I think very, very important. So as we all know, Earth Overshoot Day is the day of the year when we as humanity have used all the natural resources that the planet will renew over the entire year. And as you mentioned, last year it was August 22nd, which is almost, it's just over 3 weeks later than it is this year. And as you pointed out, that's very much due to the pandemic. All of the contraction in our economic and travel, our economies and our travel has definitely led to a major reduction last year in our consumption habits and our emissions, our carbon emissions, to the tune of, by about mid-year, we were looking at like almost a 10% decrease in carbon emissions. So the way Earth Overshoot Day is calculated is we compare humanity's ecological footprint to our biological capacity or our ability to renew. And so that calculation is the ratio essentially between what we're consuming and what the Earth can provide. So when we consume less, the ratio changes and that changes the date. But of course, we don't want the date to change because of disaster. What we saw last year was a disaster. It came at a massive human cost. And not something that is replicable and certainly doesn't fit any definition of sustainability that I would ascribe to. Sustainability, right? Sustainability means that things that we are thriving within the means of what the planet can renew. And that's thriving is an important piece of that. It's not just about we're not taking more than the planet can renew. It's that we're not taking more than the planet can renew, and we're doing so in a way where people are living good, healthy lives. So obviously the pandemic does not fit into that mold.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so if I could let you go, you can keep going on and on, but
I could.
So at this point I want to ask that what is the implication of with countries with different Earth Overshoot dates as to what is happening with the current extreme weather events, because we are seeing the hailstorm, the sandstorm, the floods, the drought, and all of these are not evenly distributed. There's this saying that African account for 3% of global warming. Why this? Why that? So can you relate it with what the Earth Overshoot have?
Yeah, absolutely. Overshoot is a result of overexploitation of people and resources. And that's the core of it, right? And when we exploit, we are not taking into account the longevity of what we're doing. And the result has been, it shows up in different ways. Overshoot includes things like, deforestation, when we're harvesting more than we can, the forest can grow back. It includes overfishing, where we have fisheries collapse because we've fished to the point of extinction in some cases. And obviously, in the biggest way, it's emitting more carbon into the atmosphere than our oceans and forests can sequester. And that is resulting in the heating of the planet. And then the heating of the planet in turn leads to these very unevenly distributed weather events and extreme weather events. And, we're starting to see that across the world, but I think especially in in parts of Africa, for example, but also in the rainforest. We saw those earlier, especially in small island nation states, where the sea rise is making a difference earlier and earlier than it would be in, say, New York or Florida. But what we're seeing with that in unequal distribution of the repercussions is the consequences of colonialism, essentially. It's the consequences of a system of exploitation that has created, that has been created out of colonialism, and will continue to get worse if there is not some pretty major changes at the global level. The good news, if there is any, is that there are tons of solutions that currently exist. We don't need to come up with brand new carbon capture technology or reinvent the wheel. There are tons of amazing solutions in terms of reducing our footprint and increasing our quality of life that already exists. We just need to get the political will and the support behind them.
I agree with you.
At level.
That's true. And this leads me to the next question, that is there a time frame at which we will all exist or exhaust these ecological resources, that there will be nothing left?
I think humans will be wiped out before that actually happens, if I'm honest about it. What we do know is that this doesn't continue forever. You cannot, by definition, be in a state of overshoot indefinitely. Because, as you mentioned, we're essentially, we've gone over budget, and there is some amount of reserve in our bank account, but it's not going to last forever. And the faster we increase our levels of consumption, the shorter that time window is. And obviously, global warming and climate change are some of the most obvious ways that is showing up. And with 60% of our ecological footprint roughly being carbon footprint, that's something that we need to start tackling immediately.
Wow.
If not 20 years ago, right? We need to start thinking about that. And then when I talk to people, it's not just let's do this for humanity, let's do this for each other. It's really important to think about this in terms of this is good for me, this is good for my community. We need to mitigate for us. We need to mitigate for my city, my town, whatever that looks like, because as resources become more constrained, and there are more of us to consume them, it becomes even more important that we can adjust our systems and our habits in a way that is compatible with a low carbon future or a zero carbon future. And so, there are ways to do that, and there's great opportunity, and it's also making our lives better if we are making decisions in a way that ensures that we're reducing our reliance on natural resource regeneration.
Okay. So that of last year Earth Overshoot came later. That was August 22nd. So what was the lesson learned that we can use for this year's Overshoot?
So I think the lesson we learned from the pandemic, and which obviously is ongoing, and the way that it moved the date last year, is that it is possible to have major policy change at the global level when something is important, right? We saw things move last year that would have taken, that people have been working on for decades, right? Have been trying to shift the conversation for decades, and that wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. But obviously that's not something we want to be, that's not something we want to replicate. We don't want to have this happen through disaster. We're hoping, our work, and I think the work of a lot of people who work in this space, is to incite that level of change and that level of the urgency of change that we saw last year with the pandemic, and apply that to the climate crisis, because that is what we are in. We are in the level of crisis that the pandemic has shown, but the pandemic moved a lot faster, and so we saw it more quickly. We don't have time for it to get to crisis mode right now. We need to be moving a lot faster.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want to ask that which sector contributes the most carbon footprint, and what impact can this green recovery that we are talking about play? Because we have been campaigning, advocating, for green recovery. What role can it play, and which of those sectors account for the biggest carbon footprints?
So the biggest carbon footprint comes from energy consumption and transportation. We have, it's very clear, and this varies country by country, but globally, we're talking about the production of energy through coal, oil, and gas. And because that's such a huge piece of the puzzle, a lot of folks are primarily focused on that. But that doesn't always make sense in a local context, which is why I think it's really important to look at contextually, look at what a community or a country is dealing with individually. So we have lots of data around this, and we have a website, an open data website, data.footprintnetwork.org, where you can go and see country by country where the biggest part of the footprint is coming from and how countries compare to one another. Also by per capita, what are the differences per capita country to country? And so I think being able to break down the footprint and Overshoot into those categories helps us make better decisions in a local context, rather than blanketly saying, okay, yes, carbon emissions are our biggest problem, it's transportation, it's shipping, whatever, fill in the blank, rather than saying, what can we do locally where we actually have some agency to make changes and make a difference in our country and our community to make a better world for ourselves.
Yeah, sure. I love the fact that they broke it down, country by countries, and also we know which country produced the largest carbon footprint